All right, so we're gonna be reading in Psalm 90 for this part of our worship, and so I'm gonna start just by reading these first couple of verses. Psalm 90, verse 1: Lord, you've been our dwelling place in all generations before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So we just changed our clocks back because that is a way we try to manage time. We are in here until 9:40, set number of minutes. We're going to be sitting here, and then at that time we'll be dismissed. We'll go on to other things. We are in all our lives bound by time. Everything that we do is managed by time. And we have things that are pleasant, but they're limited to a certain amount of time. And we have things that are unpleasant. They're also limited to a certain amount of time. Time is the great universal part of human experience. So we work for a certain number of hours, we're awake for a certain number of hours, and asleep for a certain number of hours. We spend a certain number of hours with our family, we waste a certain number of hours, and all of our lives are impacted by time. But very rarely do we take time out of that daily schedule idea that we focus on so much and zoom out a little bit and think about the broader reaches of time. Especially those of us who are younger, we don't really think about the broader picture of where time is going, how much time we have left, what we've done with all the time that we have. Part of the function of the Word of God is to get us to think about things that we wouldn't think about on our own, or that we tend not to think about, and to impart wisdom through that. And so what I want to do this morning is to look at a psalm that is focused on time, and to think about how this says we should be thinking about and using our time from a perspective that is beyond ours, specifically from God's perspective about time. So we're going to study this psalm, which is a prayer of Moses. And I want to take the time first just to read through the psalm straight through, and then we'll begin to break it down piece by piece. Psalm 90, verse 1: Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You return man to dust, and say, Return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. So this is, as the inscription at the beginning of the psalm says, this is a prayer of Moses. And I really like the suggestion one scholar made, which is this could be a meditation of Moses during the time of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. If you think about it, you remember when the children of Israel come out of Egypt, led by Moses, the Exodus and the plagues, and then they go to spy out the land. And it looks as though they're about to go into the land. They send spies out, let's figure out the land and we'll go get it. But the spies, 10 of them, bring back a bad report, and they discourage the people. Only 2, of course, bring the good report, Joshua and Caleb. And the children of Israel listen to the 10 spies, and they begin to say, why do we ever come out of Egypt? Let's go back to Egypt. Let's get rid of Moses. And so there is unbelief, and God is furious with the people because they won't believe in Him. And He says, this generation will not enter the promised land. They're going to wander until, in the words of Jehovah, their bodies are scattered in the wilderness. So, the children of Israel do. They wander. And so the book of Numbers particularly details some of those things. And they wander in the wilderness until that generation dies. So if you think about Moses as the leader of that group, what would that look like if you're Moses? I mean, wandering around, spending all your time going nowhere until these people die. And they die. How many funerals do you think Moses went to in the desert? How many graves did they have to dig in the sand? Over and over. All the people that Moses had known, the people that were contemporaries, or perhaps even a bit younger than he was, over and over, he had to think about what it was to live life and what it was to die. And so I think it's a very fitting possibility that if that's where Moses is, then this is the way Moses is going to think. And I think I'm going to teach this with that angle. You may disagree with that. That's okay. But I'm going to teach it with that angle because I think that sheds some light on some of the things that are said in this psalm. So when you spend all that time around death, and you spend all that time aimlessly spending your time, I think it changes you, and I think it produces the kinds of thoughts that Moses has here. Let's look at verse 1. In verse 1, he says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. That word dwelling place, yours might have a little bit of a different version like a refuge, but the idea of a dwelling place, I think, also seems very fitting for the desert motif. If we're wandering around, think about how there was never a place where we could live. There was nothing permanent. It was always, we're going to set up here, and then in the morning we strike camp and we move on to some new place. And so surely they got to know the Arabian desert. Surely they got to know that area where they were, but it was never home. Home was always somewhere else that we haven't got to yet. And so the idea that they're searching for something, that there is an aimlessness and a transience to life, that's all through this psalm. And I think that would have fit for the time that they were living in. I think that is really our experience. Because what we search for in life is home. We search for something that is more permanent than all the things that we know. Everything that we know has that kind of expiration date, doesn't it? If you just wait around long enough, it'll go too. And so there is that yearning. Where is it that we truly belong? What is our dwelling place? And so Moses says in verse 1, you, Lord, have been our dwelling place. You are the one constant for us. You are where we belong. In verse 2, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. I wonder if Moses is looking at the mountains as he says this. Before the mountains were brought forth, those hills in the Arabian Peninsula. Is he looking at those and saying, you know, even before the mountains, one of the oldest things that we know, we look at the earth and we say, wow, this is old, but before the mountains were brought forth, you always are. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And so far beyond what any person is, you continue to exist. Verse 3, you return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. See, that's different from man. God always is, but man is not always. Man comes from dust and returns to dust. Is Moses thinking back to Genesis 3 here, where that decree was made from God, from dust you were made and to dust you shall return. Throughout this psalm, though, and this is what I want you to notice in verse 3, throughout the psalm, man's death is attributed to God. That by the decree of God, because of man's sin, man is going to die. So that adds this tinge of sadness, of futility to life, because we know that life is only for this moment. We know that there is only a few years that we have, and then it's over. Verse 4, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. So the entire span of our lives, which are so important to us, is nothing to God. It's like yesterday when it's over. It's like a watch in the night, just a few hours. It's something that is barely noticeable to God. 10 lifetimes are like a day. 10 lifetimes like a few hours. What he's saying in verse 4 is that God sees time differently than we do. And that's something to really think about. We're going to chew on that a little later in our time studying this. But when we learn that God sees time differently than we do, it affects the way we think about God and the way we talk about God and the expectations we have of God, and especially the way we interpret what God's doing or not doing. Verse 5. You sweep them, he's talking still about man, returning man to dust. You sweep them away as with a flood. They're like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. So there are a lot of different metaphors in those two verses, and he seems to switch from one to the next. They each emphasize with their own flavor a certain part of the sort of depression that is the brevity of life. So he talks about in verse 5 that you sweep them away as with a flood, how universal death is. It sweeps everything away like a flood that just carries everything off. He talks about how it's like a dream. The idea of a dream is it's but for a moment, and that it doesn't have anything permanent. It doesn't make a change in anything. It's just almost like it's not real at all. And he talks about grass in verse 5, the last part, and in verse 6. Grass that in the morning, by the way, we live in the South, so we can relate to this. I read a commentary that had to explain, in places where it's really hot, this happens. I'm like, well, we live in a place like that. So in the morning, the grass is great, but it's been out in the heat all day. What happens to it? It starts to get parched. Okay, just think about your yard in the summer. Okay, at some point it just dries, and so there's nothing left. That's life. He says in the morning it looks great, but then by evening it's gone. It's pointless. It's worthless. It fades and withers. The grass, by the way, is a favorite image in the Bible for the brevity of life. Over and over again, we're told that all flesh is as grass. The glory of man is like the flower of the grass. And that the only thing permanent is not anything to do with man, but the Word of God that stands forever. Verse 7, for we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins, in the light of your presence. So here Moses kind of chews on the underpinnings of this situation. Why are things the way they are in terms of the brevity of life and in terms of the fact that we're all going to die? All this rootlessness, this temporariness of life. Why? And the answer he comes to in verse 7 is because of God's anger or God's wrath. God's anger and God's wrath, though, is not God's fault. Whose fault is it? It's because of man's sin. So, that has a lot of different meanings. If you talk about the idea of verse 8, you've set our iniquities before you. That's what you're looking at and focusing on. That's why you've made this experience the way it is. That could mean that Moses is talking about something that the children of Israel have done. So, if we're talking about the wandering in the wilderness, then it is the unbelief of the children of Israel, the wickedness they had in refusing to trust God. And if that's the case, then he's saying, well, obviously what we're going through right now is punishment from God. It's wrath from God. It's anger. And there are many psalms that read present situations in that very way. So that's not unheard of. But I also think there's something more universal here. That is just about the nature of life itself that stems from the garden and the sin of man in the garden and the consequences of that sin. Here's what I'm trying to say. The reason life is short is because of sin. And I have my hand in that too. I have my part in sin. I am guilty in that as well. And so when the Bible connects the brevity of life and sin, I need to say with Moses, this is my fault. On some level, I am responsible. I cannot say I'm just a victim because I also am guilty. So, the decree of God that there shall be death as a result of sin is also my fault. That then explains the situation in a way that's a little more personally relevant to me. Verse 9, for all our days pass away under your wrath, and we bring our years to an end like a sigh. The idea here to me is that we live all our days with that constant looming threat of death. It's always there. And he says, so they pass away under your wrath, and then at the end, after we've lived our whole lives knowing we can't escape death, we kind of go out with a whimper. They end like a sigh. That's life. Verse 10, the years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble, and they are soon gone, and we fly away. Remember the last number Moses mentioned? 1,000 years, back in verse 4. Now he says man can only expect 70 or maybe 80 years, and even those, he says, are full of toil and trouble and soon gone. Life is short, life is unpleasant, and we go out with a whimper. How's that for a morning pick-me-up, huh? So this sounds a lot like Ecclesiastes to me. And the difference in this and Ecclesiastes is that Moses is going to come to a happier conclusion than the writer of Ecclesiastes does. But the question that Moses is asking is, if this is all there is, and it's only for a little while, then what's the point? All our time is just full of toil and trouble anyway. Verse 11. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? There's something else tragic here, which is these facts go largely unnoticed. Have you noticed that we don't like to think about and talk about death? We probably all feel a little uncomfortable right now. It's just not pleasant. And the idea that we're going to die, we have an aversion to that. So, he is saying if we actually thought about it, if we thought about what's going to happen to us and why, we would actually be benefited from that. But who considers it? And who develops any kind of respect or fear of you because of that? No one does. This is not common. But Moses says, I want to be different. And I want the people of God to be different. And so he says in verse 12, so teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Help us to be different. Give us wisdom because we know, because we're willing to see what's going to happen and we know our hand in it. Help us to number our days rightly. We want to live better in the short time that we're here. That's what we want. And because of that, we need God's help. We need to know from Him how to number our days. We need His wisdom. We seek Him as our dwelling place. Now, the rest of this psalm is going to be specific requests from God. So let's move through those. Verse 13, he says, return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. So I believe Moses is talking about his specific situation here. Have pity on us. Perhaps he's talking about the wandering, or if we're talking about a different context, and whatever he is in, the trouble he is in, he's saying, God, end this. Enough is enough. Specifically, he's going to say, we don't have a lot of time here, God. You have punished us. Now can't you at least make the years we have left to be good? We deserved what we got, but have pity on us now as we suffer. Verse 14, satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. That morning idea goes back to the grass that was there in the morning and thriving, but now it's dying. So he says, satisfy us in the morning. Give us something that will make us joyful and glad. If we only have a little while here, take care of us in the short time that we have. Satisfy us in the morning. Help us to use our days to rejoice and be glad because we have so few of them. Verse 15. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us and for as many years as we have seen evil. So he is saying, this is a prayer. Father, you punished us. Now make us glad as long as you punished us. 16. Let your work be shown to your servants and your glorious power to their children. Show us what you're doing. Show us your great power. Let your work be shown. Let us know you and not just your wrath, not just your punishment. Verse 17, let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. That establish there to me is the cry of, give us something that we can hold on to, something that's permanent. Because there is so much here that we can just say, what do I have that lasts? So make us joyful. Give us favor instead of punishment. So that's Moses' meditation. I want to take a few minutes to digest that and to think about what that could mean for us. So the verse at the center of this psalm is verse 12. The idea of teaching us to number our days. And so I want to spend a little time thinking about how God's vision of time and how Moses' statements and thoughts about time can help us. The first idea I want to share with you is that God views time differently than we do. Back in verse 4, we saw that 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. Remember, Peter takes this verse and flips it both ways. He says to the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. Okay, well, this says 1,000 years is as a day, but Peter flips it and says, but also a day is like 1,000 years. which indicates that God can experience each day as its own, infinite amount of time. And the idea of both of those statements is simply that God doesn't see time like we do. He's not bound by time. God created time. We exist in time. God does not. God is. And God, if you want to frame it in terms of time, then you have to say God always is, or as He says, I am. Okay? Well, that doesn't help us, does it? Or the writer of Revelation is going to say, He who was, and who is to come. Okay, well, that kind of boggles the mind, right? How can you be three tenses at once? But He is. He just is. Now, the reason this helps us to say that God views time differently than we do is because it means that God is never in a hurry. And God is never late. Those are things that have to do with us in time, right? We get in hurries and we get late. Sometimes we don't show up because of time. But that's not God. It means God never lets things last too long. They're always exactly what He wants them to be. Now, they may feel like they're too long to us, but again, it's because we are stuck in time. But I want to show you that God has a much broader perspective than we do. He sees from a bigger picture, and in particular, especially this is true in our culture, we tend to not be very aware of history at all. We don't even want to think about our own history. We don't even want to think about our personal history. We want that to be in the past and washed away. God has a deep view of history. He knows what's happened before. He knows people. And He knows what's best for people. So, I believe this is one of the reasons why David in the Psalms often reasons with himself, wait on the Lord. See, for us it looks like waiting, right? But it's not waiting for God. I know that's kind of a weird idea. It kind of boggles the mind. But God is not bound by time the way we are. Sometimes we just need the patience to deal with a God who always does what He says, even though from our vantage it takes longer than we wish it would. Have you ever noticed that when you really want something, you don't ever want to wait for it? Or when you really need something, you don't ever want to wait for it? Now, I understand that feeling. I am saying the fact that God views time differently than we do just means that our urgency may not be His urgency. God is going to do what He said, and we can trust that. But God's not going to do it in the way or in the time that we think is best. Sometimes we need the patience to wait on God to answer our prayers. We need the patience to wait on God to ease our pain. We need the patience to wait on God to help our situation. And we may even feel that God is forgotten or forsaken. You see that a lot in the Psalms. But this helps us to know, well, God is just on a different timetable than I am. It's not that He doesn't care. It's that God sees time differently than I do. The second thing I want to show you here is just that man's life is short. Man's life is like grass. It's like a dream. It's 70 or 80 years, verse 10 says, and then they're soon gone. Just a little bit of time. And I know when you're very young, 70 or 80 years, well, that sounds like a huge amount of time. But as Moses says, they're soon gone. By the way, Moses probably was an old guy when he wrote this. They're soon gone. They fly away. James says, what is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. No, that's kind of an upsetting thought, isn't it? It's a mist. It's almost barely there when it's there. But mists are not known for their permanence. That's the point. It's there for a little while and then vanishes. That's our life. So, as we seek meaning in life, whether we're seeking meaning in life by following God, or we're seeking meaning in life by trying to find pleasure or relationships or whatever it is, however we seek meaning in life, we will always be plagued by the fact that we just don't have a lot of time. Our lives are short. And so the question that always plagues us is, what will become of everything that we are and everything that we've done? The things that are so important to us right now, what happens to them? What happens to all the feelings that we feel, and all the thoughts that we think, and all the work that we do, and all the money that we make, and all the investments we make in people and relationships, the people that we love? What happens to all of it? We know what happens to all of it. Its lifespan is short too. So we yearn for something that will last. We try to survive for a few years. We try to find what joy we can here. We age and we die unless our life is cut short earlier. These are realities we have to cope with. I know it's not pleasant, but it is true. And we have to accept this before we can accept where this is intended to lead us. So, the third thing I want to say about this is that we have to learn to number our days. Verse 12. So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. The idea of numbering our days, I believe, is about using these thoughts that help us to do our best in working in the days that we do have, so that we can gain wisdom to live in the best way. Because we don't want to waste our time. We don't have much of it. We have to use it in the best way. Knowing that I have a limited amount of time helps me, because it reminds me I can't just do things that don't really matter. I have to invest my time in the things that do matter. Each day is not just a day to be survived. In Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 10, the writer says, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going." So there are things that need to be done. And he says you do them with the vigor and the passion they deserve, because this is your shot. This is the time you have. And you're not promised more than that. So you do it because there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol. Sheol is a word for the grave, where you are going. The reminder is we are headed toward the grave, and so we work now with the passion those things deserve. Father, teach us to number our days. We live in a culture that is preoccupied with wasting time. It is ironic because on the one hand, we complain about how we don't have enough time. And on the other hand, we spend so much of our time wasting it on the little pleasures of our little phones and gadgets, on our little pleasures of our hobbies and the fun things that we get to do. And then we say, "Oh no, I don't have any time." There may be nothing wrong with occasional entertainment as a break from all the work that we have to do, from the stresses that we experience, but we have to ask the question, am I using the few days I have well? Father, teach us to number our days. As young people, we often live with the illusion that we have an infinite number of days. Life's just going to keep on going. There will always be days later on where I can do right. There will always be days later on to pursue the life that I want, to treat people the way I know I should, to take care of the things that matter, to accomplish what I want to accomplish. There's always more time later. And so we spend our time in foolish disputes, foolish pursuits, not disputes. We can do that too. But we're banking on the idea that someday I'll get around to it, and then I'll do what I should. Sometimes I've talked to those who are older, who lived their youth in that spirit. And uniformly what they say to me is, "What a waste. I can't believe how much time I've wasted." Father, teach us to number our days. Many of our days are tinged with anxiety about what's going to happen. I'm not very old, but I've lived through several presidencies now. And I remember how upset everyone was when Bill Clinton was president. And then I remember how upset everyone was when George Bush was president. And then I remember how upset everyone was when Barack Obama was president. And now I see how upset everyone is that Donald Trump is president. It doesn't really matter what party they are. Somebody's living with anxiety about who's president. And the funny thing about that is, if you just wait a little while, it'll change. That's the nature of it. And it's interesting to me that sometimes we live with anxiety about things that we know are going to change. We know they're not permanent. And so we waste our time, and we use our time poorly because we don't number our days properly. There are situations in life. Do you remember those who are a little older being young and you wanted a romantic partner? It just seemed like you never find one. You worry about it. You think about it all the time. Those days pass, one way or another. Those who have young children, the anxieties of that stage in life. Those who have teenage children and the anxieties of that stage in life. They're difficult, but they're not permanent. They pass. To be anxious about things that are going to change means we need to learn to number our days. I needed to learn to number my minutes. I'm going to say two more things and then I'll be done. Sometimes we get frustrated with things that take a long time to develop, and we don't want to invest the time we need now. We want the results now. This is a matter of numbering our days. And then there are times where we see someone we love die, and we have to deal with the heartache and the grief that comes. And I just want to say that there will be a day when Moses' words are no longer true, when we will see beyond just what Moses saw because of the sacrifice of Jesus and the resurrection of Christ. And we know that this life, the 70 or 80 years, is not the end. And because of that, we number our days in preparation for what is to come. Thank you for your attention this morning.